On the edge of Ravenna, in northern Italy, there's a tomb. Its roof is one single block of stone, 10 meters across, 230 tons. Somebody cut it out of a cliff on the far side of the Adriatic, shipped it across the sea, and lifted it into place 1,500 years ago. Nobody is quite sure how. The Romans didn't build it. It was built for a man the Romans called a barbarian. His people had spent 80 years as slaves of the Huns. He himself would rule Italy for 30 years, and the Senate of Rome would call him Lord. His name was Theodoric. His people were the Ostrogoths. And here's the strange part. Within one lifetime of his death, they were gone. Not defeated and folded into some other empire. Gone. By the year 562, there was nobody left in the world who called himself an Ostrogoth. This is the story of how a people climbed from slavery to the throne of Italy, and how they vanished. Start 150 years earlier, and 1,000 miles east, the grasslands north of the Black Sea. Today it's Ukraine and southern Russia, flat, open country where the horizon never ends. In the 4th century, this was Gothic land. The Goths hadn't started here. Their ancestors had walked down from the Baltic coast, near modern Dansk, generations before. By the 300s they ruled the steppe. Their king was called Ermanaric, and his reach ran from the Don River to the Dniester, from the Black Sea up to the Pripyat marshes. Later writers claimed he lived to be 110. That's probably legend. But it tells you something. Nobody could remember a time before him. Then, around the year 370, riders came out of the east, the Huns. Mounted archers on small, fast horses, with bows that outranged anything the Goths carried. They didn't form lines. They didn't besiege towns. They circled, shot, vanished, and came back. A Gothic wall of spearmen was useless against an enemy that never came close enough to touch. Ermanaric was the most powerful man the Goths had ever produced. Facing the Huns, he did not lead his army out. He killed himself. His people were left to choose. Some ran west, crossed the Danube into Roman territory, and became the people history calls the Visigoths. That's another story. Ours follows the ones who stayed. They knelt. And for the next 80 years, the Ostrogoths belonged to the Huns. What does it mean to belong to someone? It means your herds feed their army. Your sons ride in their wars. Your king rules only as long as the masters find him useful. 3 generations of Ostrogoths were born knowing nothing else. By the 440s, the Hun Empire had a single master, Attila. And in 451, when he invaded Gaul, the Ostrogoths rode with him. On the other side of the field that day, fighting for Rome, stood the Visigoths. Cousin against cousin, on a battlefield neither of them had chosen. That is what belonging to someone means. 2 years later, Attila celebrated a new marriage. In the morning they found him dead. He had burst a blood vessel in the night and drowned in his own blood, at his own wedding feast. His sons started fighting over the inheritance before the funeral was done. The subject peoples watched the masters tearing at each other. Then they rose. Within a couple of years, the Hun Empire, the terror of 2 continents, simply ceased to exist, and the Ostrogoths walked out of 80 years of servitude, free, armed, and with nowhere to go. Rome gave them land inside the Balkan frontier and paid them gold to guard it. It was the standard Roman recipe for dangerous neighbors. Hire them, feed them, and point them at somebody else. Right around the time of Attila's death, a boy was born to the Ostrogothic royal house. His father would send him away at the age of 8, not to school, as a hostage. The boy was called Theodoric, and the place he was sent to was Constantinople. Try to see it through his eyes. He comes from a world of wagons, tents, and timber halls, and then the walls of Constantinople come over the horizon. Triple walls, the largest fortifications on earth. 500,000 people inside, paved streets, aqueducts feeding public fountains, a stadium that held more people than his whole nation had warriors. He spent 10 years there, a hostage, but a royal one, raised at court, watching the empire from the inside. And what he learned was the most dangerous knowledge a barbarian ever took home. He learned that the empire was not a miracle, it was a machine. Taxes paid soldiers, courts settled feuds, grain ships fed cities. A machine has parts, and parts can be learned, and what can be learned can be run. He also learned how Constantinople handled people like his. Pay one tribe to fight another. Promise everything, deliver as little as possible, never bleed for what gold can do. At 18 he went home. At about 20 he became king of the Ostrogoths. For the next 14 years, he and his people lived inside that Roman game, in the Balkans. Sometimes he held an imperial title and fought for the emperor. Sometimes the payments stopped, and he burned imperial provinces until they resumed. Rome made him a consul, the highest honor it could give. He also, at one point, marched on Constantinople itself. The Emperor Zeno had a problem, and the problem had a name. A brilliant, unpredictable Gothic king camped far too close to his capital. So Zeno made him an offer: Italy. Italy at that moment wasn't ruled by an emperor. The last Western emperor had been quietly retired years earlier by a soldier named Odoacer, a general of barbarian origin, who now ran Italy as its king. Constantinople had never accepted it. Zeno's offer was simple: go take Italy from Odoacer. If you win, rule it. In my name, of course. Whatever happened, Zeno won. Either his Gothic problem destroyed his Italian problem, or the two destroyed each other. Theodoric said yes, and in the autumn of 488, the Ostrogoths moved, not an army, a people. Something like 100,000 men, women, and children, with wagons, herds, forges, everything they owned. A column like that moves at walking pace. It has to fight its way through other people's lands, ford rivers with ox carts, and feed itself as it goes. The journey took almost a year. In late August 489, they came down out of the mountains into Italy, and Odoacer was waiting at the river Isonzo. Theodoric beat him there, beat him again at Verona. Odoacer fell back on Ravenna, and there the war stopped. Ravenna sat in the middle of marshes and lagoons. You couldn't get an army near the walls, so Theodoric settled in to starve him out. It took 3 years. In 493, with the city eating its leather, the local bishop brokered a deal. The two kings would rule Italy together. Joint rule, equal honors. The gates opened. 10 days later, Theodoric hosted a banquet for Odoacer. During the toasts, 2 of his men grabbed Odoacer by the hands. Theodoric drew his sword and cut him down. The story goes that the blow split him from shoulder to hip, and Theodoric looked at the body and said, "The wretch had no bones." Odoacer's loyal soldiers were hunted through the city that same day. The joint rule of Italy had lasted about a week and a half. You'd expect the reign that began with that banquet to be a nightmare. What followed instead was 33 years of the best government Italy had seen in living memory. The contradiction has a name: Theodoric the Great. He kept the Roman machine running exactly as he'd learned it as a boy. The Senate still met. Roman law still governed Romans. Gothic law, Goths. Taxes came down. The grain dole was paid. Aqueducts were repaired. Marshes drained. The ports dredged. Roman writers of his own time described the reign the way people describe a golden age. He was, by the standards of the age, shockingly tolerant. He was an Arian Christian, a heretic in Catholic eyes, ruling a Catholic country, and he protected Catholic churches. When rioters burned down the synagogues of Ravenna, Theodoric made the rioters pay to rebuild them. Ravenna filled with palaces and mosaics. If you've ever seen a photo of a golden mosaic ceiling from Italy, there's a fair chance you were looking at his city. But 2 flaws were built into the Golden Age, and both were fatal. First, to Constantinople. He was still just a governor who had never been given permission to become a king. On paper, Italy remained imperial territory. That paper sat in the archives, waiting for an emperor strong enough to use it. Second, he had no son. Near the end, the old king felt the ground shifting. He saw conspiracies in the Senate, real or imagined. Boethius, the finest philosopher of the age and his own chief minister, was accused of treason, imprisoned, and executed. It was the great stain on the reign, and by some accounts Theodoric regretted it to his last day. In 526 he died in Ravenna, and was laid under the stone he had ordered for himself while he was still alive. The throne of Italy passed to a 10-year-old. The boy was his grandson, Athalaric. The real ruler was the boy's mother, Theodoric's daughter, Amalasuntha. She was fluent in Latin and Greek, Roman in her tastes, and she governed well. The Gothic nobles resented her for all 3. Athalaric drank himself into a grave at 18. Amalasuntha, needing a man beside the throne, raised her cousin Theodahad to co-ruler. Within months he had her seized and shipped to an island on a volcanic lake, and in the spring of 535, she was strangled in her bath. In Constantinople, a new emperor had been waiting for exactly this kind of news. Justinian ruled a rich, confident Eastern empire, and he had one consuming idea: take the West back. A year earlier, his army had crushed the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in a single season. Now a Gothic usurper had murdered a friendly queen. That was all the legal cover he needed. The army he sent to Italy in 535 was small, but its commander was Belisarius, the best general the empire had. Sicily fell almost without a fight. Naples was taken through a dry aqueduct channel. Rome opened its gates. The Goths regrouped and threw everything at getting Rome back. For a year, Belisarius held the city with a few thousand men against the whole Gothic army. The Goths cut the aqueducts that had run for 6 centuries. Most never ran again. The great baths of Rome went quiet in 537 and stayed quiet. Wars kill more than people. By 540, Belisarius stood before Ravenna, the marsh capital that had once defied Theodoric for 3 years. He didn't storm it. The exhausted Goths inside made him an astonishing offer. Be our king. Take the crown of the West for yourself. Belisarius pretended to accept, rode in through the open gates, and raised Justinian's banner instead. After 5 years of war, the Gothic kingdom seemed finished. It should have ended there. It didn't. Belisarius was recalled. The plague came, the great pandemic of Justinian's reign, and gutted the empire's armies and its tax rolls. Byzantine officials squeezed Italy like a conquered province, and the Goths who were left found a new king, a young commander named Attila. Attila understood what his predecessors hadn't. This was no longer a war between kingdoms. It was a war for survival, and the side with nothing to lose fights differently. He freed slaves and enlisted them. He took the countryside and let the cities starve. Over 10 years, he clawed back almost the entire peninsula. Rome changed hands again and again. At one point, the city that had once held 1 million people stood, for a few weeks, practically empty. Justinian finally sent an army worthy of the war, and gave it to the unlikeliest commander imaginable, Narses, a court eunuch in his 70s. The Goths laughed. They shouldn't have. In the summer of 552, the armies met at a place called Tagine, high in the Apennines. Before the battle, in the open ground between the lines, Attila rode out alone, in gilded armor, and performed the old war dance, wheeling his horse, throwing his spear high and catching it at the gallop. He was buying time for 2,000 riders who hadn't arrived yet. It's one of the last things history records the Ostrogoths doing as a free people, and it changed nothing. Narses had set his line as a trap, dismounted spearmen in the center. On each wing, thousands of archers curved forward like horns. The Gothic cavalry was ordered to charge with lances only, straight up the middle. They rode into a crossfire that emptied saddles by the hundred, and then the counterattack rolled over what was left. Attila fled the field with a lance wound and died in a village that night. The survivors crowned one last king. His name was Tia. He fought his final battle a few months later at the foot of Vesuvius, on a slope they called the Milk Mountain. When his shield grew too heavy with the javelin stuck in it, he called for a fresh one, and in the moment of the exchange, a spear caught him in the chest. His men fought on for 2 more days after he fell. Then they asked, not for mercy, but for passage. Let us leave Italy and live under our own laws somewhere else. Narses agreed. A handful of towns in the north refused to quit and held on year after year, garrison by garrison. The last of them gave in 562. 27 years after Belisarius landed in Sicily, the war was over. And so, quietly, was a people. How does a people stop existing? Not by dying to the last man. The survivors of the Milk Mountain marched away and out of history. The northern garrisons dispersed. Families scattered into the Frankish lands, into the Alps, into the general bloodstream of Europe. Within a generation, there were no Ostrogothic laws, no Ostrogothic kings, no reason for a child to grow up calling himself an Ostrogoth. The names stopped being useful. Names that stop being useful die. As for the prize, Justinian had bought Italy back with 20 years of war and plague that emptied it. 6 years after the last Gothic garrison gave in, a people called the Lombards came over the Alps and took most of the peninsula, almost unopposed. Everything the Gothic War had been fought for was lost within a generation. If anyone won that war, it wasn't Rome either. Back in Ravenna, the tomb is still there. The victors turned it into a church and removed the king's bones. Nobody wrote down where they went. Inside, there's an empty basin of purple stone. Above it, that impossible roof, with an old crack running through it. The Ostrogoths held Italy for 2 generations. They rose from the floor of the Hunnic Empire to the throne of the Caesars, ran Rome better than Rome had run itself in a century, and then were removed from the world so completely that their enemies had to write their story, or there would be no story at all. Everything we know about them, we know from the people who destroyed them, except for one thing they left behind that needs no translation. It's in Ravenna. It weighs 230 tons, and it isn't going anywhere.